It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, John Wilkins, the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau at the FCC. John was previously the Managing Director at the FCC, where he served as the agency's Chief Operating Official and acted as advisor for management to FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler. In that dual role, he oversaw both the agency's $500 million operating budget as well as the Universal Service Fund, which supports over $8 billion annually in advanced telecommunications services. John joined the FCC in November 2013. Prior to that, he spent 16 years at McKinsey and Company's Washington, D.C. office, where he became a partner and partner in 2003 and was a leader in McKinsey's telecommunications, media, and technology practice. His consulting practice focused on the impact of broadband technologies in the wireless, cable, and consumer devices markets around the world. He also served as policy advisor in the Office of Plans and Policy at the FCC from 98 to 99, and as a federal judicial law clerk from 95 to 96. He graduated from Yale Law School in 95 and Dartmouth College in 92. So please give a round of applause for John. Thank you very much for coming. Oh yeah, you have mic.
How's the mic? Can you hear me? Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to come today. I'm actually very excited to be here. So let me just say why. The FCC, we have a pretty broad agenda of things we work on. But I can actually say unequivocally that the question of how to promote 5G deployment in the U.S. on millimeter wave technology has probably been the single biggest priority, certainly in my bureau, in the Wireless Bureau this year. And the chairman himself would say it is probably the #1 issue on his agenda as well. And we do a lot of other things, so that's a pretty strong statement. But there really is incredible excitement at the FCC and elsewhere in the federal government about the promise of 5G technology, the research that all of you do, and it really is a big deal. And so what I wanted to do in this keynote is just try to give you more of an overview of overall federal policy in this area. I will talk in some detail about the millimeter wave spectrum piece of it, but there's actually a slightly bigger context that I thought would be helpful for you to understand as you proceed with the next 2 days. First, the FCC is not an agency built for speed. We are a legal agency. We have all kinds of administrative process we have to follow. Those of you that ever followed FCC proceedings know that it can take years for the FCC to do things sometimes, and that's by design. It's a deliberative agency. But we have been moving with incredible speed in the millimeter wave area. And the reason is it really is a national priority, not just for my boss, Chairman Wheeler, but really at all parts of the federal government. The federal government policy really does look at 5G deployment in the U.S. as an incredibly important area of economic policy, and not just in the communications sector, where it certainly is a big deal, and those of you that work with wireless carriers or in the industry know that it's a big deal for those companies, and they will be investing tens of billions of dollars. But we really do look at 5G deployment, right? Super high capacity, low latency, small cells, as the last piece of the puzzle of the broadband networks that have been built out over the last 10 to 15 years. And we really are heading for an environment where you truly will have ubiquitous, ultra high speed, low latency connectivity anywhere. And that will have big impacts in all kinds of areas of the economy besides just the communication sector. And so we really do look at this as a huge deal. And so the efforts of the government, the speed with which we've been working, the priority that's been given does reflect that. And in particular, what is the goal? Well, the goal, and we can actually be very precise about this, we want the United States to be the lead market for 5G deployment at scale in the world. Those of you who probably know better than we do exactly what that timeline looks like. What we're told by industry is that is a 2019 kind of initial deployment, 2020 deployment at scale. The standards bodies obviously are working pretty hard to try to keep up with that pace. At the FCC, we're certainly seeing that kind of activity from the core wireless carriers we talk to. So that's what we're working against. And by government timelines, that is the blink of an eye. But that's the timeline that we're working against. We want the U.S. to lead the world. And in particular, not just because of the direct investment benefits, the things that will come from that, we do see this as a really important virtuous cycle for the United States. And the model we have is 4G LTE, right? The U.S. leads the world in LTE. That actually reflects a bunch of policy choices that were made by the U.S. government in past years. And the benefits to that, we think, are pretty substantial, right? The U.S. market really has now become the market where, because LTE started there, our companies that work in mobile broadband have huge advantages. And there's lots of stats that people talk about U.S. companies, U.S. technology really is the lead global technology in LTE, and we think a lot of that's because we started here first. The U.S. market obviously is a huge market, right? And if the policy is in place, investment will flow, and we think that the virtuous cycle kicks off from there. It was true for 4G, and we think it's going to be even more true for 5G. So, huge sense of urgency in the government, huge sense of urgency in research, academia, as those of you in the room know, and in industry. And I can say in the Wireless Bureau, we deal with industry all the time on all kinds of issues. The interest in 5G and interest in millimeter wave spectrum is very high up on the list of things that I hear that my Bureau hears day to day. So, not that anyone in this room probably had a doubt, but this is a very important topic, and there's just no question there's going to be huge, huge activity, huge investment dollars in the years to come. So let me paint that slightly broader picture I referred to. What has been the overall policy focus for FCC with regard to these issues? At the end, I will talk in more detail about the millimeter wave pieces because there's a lot to say there, but let me provide a little bit more context first. So at the FCC, we think about 5G deployment as one of these classic three-legged stools, right? So what are the three legs from our perspective? Well, spectrum, of course, but I'll get to that last. There's two other important legs, though. Siting, right? So this is kind of the opposite of the advanced technology research kind of focus that all of you do. This is the day-to-day blocking and tackling of, given the propagation characteristics of millimeter wave, building out this infrastructure is not going to be a few thousand large towers, right? So for macro towers, there's only about 300,000 towers in the whole country that do traditional low-band cellular coverage. There's going to be an order of magnitude more towers that have to get built. And that is going to test local siting, right? So this is about as day-to-day as it gets. You know, municipal governments who have built processes for siting cell towers over the last 10 years that's around a model of, okay, T-Mobile or American Tower wants to build a tower out here on the highway or maybe in a residential area. And you have all kinds of complex reviews around just local interest to make sure that that tower isn't too much of an eyesore, doesn't create environmental impacts, et cetera, et cetera. That will take months, and it'll cost a fair bit of money, but given that it's one tower at a time and it's an investment built around that large tower, essentially we figured out a way to do that. In the last 9 to 12 months, small cell deployment, not yet for millimeter wave, of course, but really driven by 4G densification, which between now and 5G deployment is really how the carriers see capacity growing, has led to just an incredible surge of small cell siting applications in cities all over the country. In fact, there was a Montgomery County, Maryland, they're kind of the relevant siting board, had a statistic. They've had more applications for cell siting in the last 4 months than they have in the last 10 years. And it's because actually the big carriers are all of a sudden working with their vendors to say, we want to build 1,500 small cells in not just downtown Washington, but out in denser suburbs. And that's just straining the local government's ability to deal with this, right? So putting aside whatever technology we figure out, other policy things, there's a very real operational problem of we need to find ways to streamline the deployment of these small cells. So the government does have certain authority over that. It actually reflects our founding fathers' balance of federal, state, and local power. There's some federal statutes that deal with when can the federal government preempt local laws. What other authority do we have? There's a whole stream of work going on at the FCC with industry, with local governments, trying to find ways to streamline that. So I'll leave it at that. It could be a much longer topic. But it's one of these issues where if we don't get all three legs right, the stool won't stand up. And when you just do the math around the number of small cells that industry is talking about deploying, if the processes don't improve, whatever else happens, we will not meet that 2019-2020 goal. So that's topic one. Topic two is backhaul. Right? You build these small cells out, you can deliver gigabit through to a 28 gigahertz small cell. You're going to need to have fiber pulling that back into the network. that too is non-obvious how it's going to work, right? There's been a lot of fiber that's been built out. Competition policy in the U.S. has been good for that. There's third-generation fiber companies that are building lots of fiber. But again, if you just do the math around the densification that people are talking about for these small cells, even in urban areas where you've got fiber going down lots of streets, getting fiber pulled to every street corner where there might be a small cell, and then especially as you get out slightly outside the downtown cores, how will not just that investment work? Frankly, the investment probably is easier. But again, the local processes, and especially in areas where, you know, downtown Washington, there's plenty of competitors offering fiber. It'll probably work itself out fine there. But if the promise of 5G is this ubiquitous coverage, lots of places besides urban cores, in some places there's not multiple fiber providers. How do you deal with competition issues? How do you make sure essentially that the economics of fiber being provided to small cell deployment doesn't become a barrier in and of itself? So the FCC also has had major activity in that area. There's a rulemaking that's pending. It remains the focus of lots of our competition oversight to make sure that backhaul doesn't become a barrier, again, if everything else gets solved. Now, lastly, probably most importantly, most of interest for this room, is spectrum policy. Let me say a couple of broader observations. You know, first, spectrum policy for the United States has actually been a global competitive advantage for the last 20 years. If you look at what the FCC has done going back to the 90s, innovations that today seem reasonably straightforward, probably most importantly, the idea of using auctions to allocate spectrum to make sure they go to the highest economic use. In the mid-90s, when that was rolled out, it was viewed as hugely controversial, and is that going to work, and does it make sense? You know, that now, of course, is absolute gospel when it comes to spectrum policy around the world. Unlicensed spectrum. A friend of mine who was at the FCC 20 years ago said when they created unlicensed spectrum rules, there was sort of this general sense of this may be the dumbest thing we ever did. No one will see any incentive to invest. It won't work. And, of course, now that's become a huge, huge part of what deployment and use looks like. So we have a long history of innovation in spectrum policy, and we're bringing that into the 5G spectrum policy as well. First is just speed, right? Those of you that follow some of these bands know that, for example, in 28 gigahertz, at the international conferences in the last year and a half, there's a lot of resistance to using 28 gigahertz, incumbent interests in other countries in satellites, for example. The U.S. government, we sort of just pushed ahead. We said, well, you know, there's not an international agreement yet. We think it's hugely important. So, for example, in our Spectrum Frontiers rulemaking last summer, we went ahead with rules in 28 gigahertz, and we think that was an incredibly good decision because that's where we're going to actually see first deployment, we think, and we're starting to see evidence that other countries and certainly industry is all of a sudden a lot more interested in 28 because we took that just aggressive step of saying, no, we need to go ahead and not wait too long for all the coordination. Other spectrum areas, the use of more flexible licensing techniques is very important. Right? When it comes to spectrum policy, you're always trying to balance maximum incentive for investment. So giving a big company with a big capital budget exclusive license rights for a long period of time is a pretty good way to do that. And so AT&T and T-Mobile and Verizon and Sprint and other wireless carriers like that model. But an important thing in 5G is, as important as what wireless carriers will do, the economic benefits of 5G will also come from all kinds of other networks being deployed, more disruptive business models being deployed. And so an important consideration for our licensing policy is making sure we also create licensing rules that allow entry from either startups or maybe new companies that don't have as crystal clear of an investment case as 4G investment, right? Because the flip side of that exclusive license model is, yes, if you are a large company with a very clear investment case, you'll pay a lot for spectrum to get exclusive rights, and you will deploy it. And we've proven that, no question. And so that's been one big focus of our policy in this area. But there are also other areas, other parts of the millimeter wave spectrum this summer, for example, where we created different licensing rules specifically to try to make sure there were opportunities for new entrants that may well not have either the capital or the business case to say, yes, we're going to spend $1 billion on this spectrum. And you need all of those to make sure that you're maximizing the economic benefit. So I'll touch on a few of those as I go into specific bands. But the last part of our spectrum policy that's worth really emphasizing before I go to millimeter wave is that at the FCC, we do view the 5G spectrum question as one of these all of the above, as we like to say in the government. So low band, mid band, and high band. Just in the low band, right now we are in the middle of by far the most complex, interesting auction the FCC's ever done, which is this auction to essentially reallocate broadcast TV spectrum, 600 megahertz, from one-way broadcast use to two-way mobile use. A hugely, hugely complicated policy proceeding because of all the economic interest involved. But that's moving along, and sometime the first part of next year, that auction will conclude, and that'll bring, give or take, 100 megahertz of the low-band 600 megahertz spectrum that, as I know this room knows, from a coverage and propagation standpoint, is really important for whatever your future network is, just because of the way it can provide control plane, can provide coverage, and so that idea of making sure we don't take our eye off the traditional low-band ball while we're focused on millimeter wave has been important. So that's happening. Mid-band, some of you may have followed, earlier this year the FCC completed rules for using 3.5 gigahertz, 150 megahertz of spectrum, and that's one where I would just really emphasize this flexible licensing policy that I was talking about. So 3.5 gigahertz, we took a very, very different, innovative approach to how that spectrum can be used. A portion of it will be available for exclusive use in auctions, but the majority is being held open essentially for, I guess the way to say it is a hybrid between licensed and unlicensed, right? You can get more rights to it as a commercial user than traditional unlicensed. But it's more of a license by rule. You can come in, you use it as long as you're using it, you have protection from interference, and the key is it's actually implemented through these spectrum access systems, right, where you actually implement in the network the interference coordination. So that's a proceeding that's been adopted by the FCC. My staff is implementing it, so there are a number of companies that have put forth proposals for how these spectrum access systems will work, and it'll actually, we think, within a year or two, make that really powerful 3.5 gigahertz band available, not just for big carriers, but for new entrants to use too. And then we get to what you're all here to actually talk about, which is millimeter wave. Right? And so what have we been doing? So in the intros, so Spectrum Frontiers, that was part one of millimeter wave licensing for the FCC. So that was a formal rules that were adopted by the FCC this past July. It adopted licensing rules in the 28 gigahertz band. We call it 37 to 39, but it's sort of 37 to 37.6 and 37.6 to 39, and 64 to 71. Importantly, and I'll say a little bit more about what we're doing in those bands, but so importantly, so those are service rules. So you as a commercial entity looking to deploy spectrum can now say with certainty that in those bands there are clear regulations, clear licensing rules for terrestrial mobile service. And just as one sign of interest here, Verizon recently completed a transaction that was clearly based on an understanding of where the FCC was likely to go in those rules, where they acquired a company called XO Communications, which is, most people think of as a fiber company, but actually had legacy rights to a huge amount of 28 gigahertz spectrum. And as part of that transaction, essentially Verizon now does have those 28 gigahertz rights from XO. And that's the way the FCC usually works. If it's spectrum that we hold or that is in our inventory, we auction that. But if an incumbent licensee, for example, 28 gigahertz previously was a fixed LMDS service is what we called it in regulatory parlance. If you as an acquirer acquire that spectrum or acquire the company that owns that spectrum, title transfers to you. So Verizon actually has a nationwide 28 gigahertz footprint today. And there's a lot of discussion that Verizon is likely to be the first one to move. And one of the previous slides talked about the fixed wireless applications as a first step. That's what Verizon is talking about initially, publicly, is they'll use 28 gigahertz initially, even in the next year or two, with that as they figure out mobile. So in and of itself, we really have gone from a year ago not even having service rules to a nationwide carrier with fully usable rights in 28 gigahertz today. And that's hugely significant because we think that alone is creating a sense of competition and rivalry with other carriers, and all of a sudden we're seeing a lot more interest in lots of other bands as well. Two other important things to point out in that Frontiers 1. So 28 gigahertz, pretty clean. Verizon has it. As I know a lot of you know, the main issue there was how to coordinate incumbent satellite use with terrestrial mobile use. And it was a pretty heated industry discussion, but I think what it really proved is it's perfectly easy for the regulator working with the different groups to come up with service rules that'll work, right? And you can protect satellite use. And the reality is 5G, 28 gigahertz small cells can be deployed almost everywhere in the country and still leave plenty of protection for satellite installations. There will be some interesting issues going forward as some of the low Earth orbit mobile satellite constellations are being ramped up, and how that'll be coordinated will be a big issue going forward. But 28 gigahertz showed that we really can do this, especially when it's commercial to commercial coordination. Now, 37 gigahertz is the different flavor. It's large incumbent federal allocations and both federal use, but importantly, federal agencies, the DoD, others, actually worry about their future needs too, right? So it's not just as simple as saying, well, we have some satellites and let's protect those. It's, well, we may well want to use some of this in the future, and let's make sure what the FCC does doesn't foreclose us. So a really important thing in 37 to watch is we actually didn't finalize those rules for 37. What we did was created from 37 to 37.6, essentially a requirement that there be a sharing regime between commercial users and federal users, and it's mostly Department of Defense. And we then, we didn't kick the can down the road. That's not fair to our team. We asked more questions, sort of kept the administrative process going on exactly what that looks like. And so there is now an ongoing proceeding that will be Spectrum and Frontiers Part 2 that has to do a couple of things. It will have to refine the rules for how that sharing will work in the lower 37 band. And we also have teed up 8 additional bands. And again, maybe you all know this, but I'll just tick it off real quick. So in addition to what we've already done, we now have a newly in-progress rulemaking that could be concluded as soon as this coming summer. I think there's a goal that it be done in 2017. In 24 gigahertz band, 32, 42, 47 to 50, 50 to 52, 71 to 76, 81 to 86, and above 95. So that's 8 additional bands, and it's actually quite a bit more total spectrum than even we did in round 1. So the reason I emphasize that is as much excitement as Frontiers Part 1 has generated, the progress in 28, 39 gigahertz has some other issues around a couple of incumbent companies have it, and there may be transactions coming out where people are trying to buy that spectrum too, like Verizon did. We'll see what happens there. But there is a lot of interest in these initial bands. But pretty much everyone is recognizing it's not going to be enough given the needs and the interest. And so this Part 2 of Frontiers, teeing up multiple additional bands, more total capacity, and those of you who know those bands, though, some of those additional bands actually have a lot more complexity to them, right? There's just the incumbent interests have lots of nuances. Let's see, which one is it? In 42, you're adjacent to radio astronomy, questions about how interference works when you're talking about very particularized scientific research needs. What does that mean for commercial use? There's just a lot more complexity to be worked through. But the reason that we started with, relatively speaking, some easier bands in round 1 was to try to at least get momentum going. And we think we accomplished that goal. We think what we did with 28, what we did with 37 to 39, and then, of course, 64 is an unlicensed band, and actually pretty straightforward because it's right up against the 71 band, which is also unlicensed. We think that the first step is clear enough that we will get investment in research and momentum going. And then this next round on these additional bands where there's more complexity, I think people will be that much more engaged and realize the stakes are pretty high and the FCC really is going to move, and that'll help us continue to make progress. Let me just conclude by saying timing for the rest of these rulemakings, it is worth noting that, we did have an election last month in the country. That means all federal agencies will see changes of leadership, right? So there'll be a different majority on the FCC, and all the other agencies will have various changes in political leadership. I will say that in any agency, the FCC is no exception. New leadership means there will be in some areas different policy priorities, and that'll play out in various ways. This one, though, is about as bipartisan as it gets. Those of you that follow the FCC know that in some areas we've had quite contentious 3-2 votes in Democrats and Republicans. This was a 5-0 vote. There's a little bit of debate around the margins of exactly how licensing rules work, but in the scheme of things, there's no question that the FCC is going to continue to want to move this quickly. So I would just not for a second think that uncertainty about what the FCC is going to look like for a few months is going to impact this at all. The one thing that I would note, and just because you are all in the community of people working on these issues, the one concern I have is just that, especially in these additional bands, where there is a lot of other federal agency coordination required, not just the DoD, but lots of other agencies. Right? If you are a senior official in charge of spectrum at a given agency, I actually think people in good faith want to engage in these broader policy efforts for the national good when there is clear political leadership saying this is a priority. But absent that, you do tend to want to look out for your agency's interests. And there's lots of agencies that have made big investments in all kinds of technology related to their spectrum. And I think the question I have is going forward, just as new administration leadership is sorted out in many other agencies, frankly, besides the FCC, just how will the coordination work on some of these bands where you actually do need federal agency alignment to move forward with rules that allow new uses, allow commercial uses, that preserve the federal use, but may well do it in ways that requires a little bit more effort or planning. And I think it is worth saying, just as a concluding thought, so obviously I've been serving the Obama administration. This administration has made spectrum policy just a huge, huge priority, going back to early 2009. If you look at FCC auctions, just as one metric of general spectrum activity, in the 8 years before 2008, the FCC only issued a few thousand licenses via auction. Since 2008, especially if you include our new 3.5 gigahertz auction, which is going to be coming up hopefully pretty soon, we will have auctioned over 1 million licenses. Now, in part, that is a reflection of how big the licenses are, but it's a huge additional number of bands, and it's not really the FCC. I mean, the FCC was a big supporter, but it really was the fact that the federal agencies and the White House and NTIA really did make spectrum access and more engagement with federal spectrum being made available for new uses just a big priority. And some senator, I think, said policy is personnel and personnel is policy when it comes to these issues. And so that's just the question: is how big of a focus will these spectrum issues continue to get? Given there is going to be a big change in the leadership dealing with these issues. But that said, the FCC is not going to let up. I think there is no question that millimeter wave licensing, auctions over the next 1 to 2 years is going to be the top 2 or 3 items of the FCC, and so all the work that you're going to be doing around actually how the technology is going to work and what deployment looks like, I think the policy will be in place to support that. So I'll stop there. And by the way, tomorrow my colleague Julie Knapp, who I guess many of you know, certainly could talk a lot more about some of the technical sides of those licensing. The international issues are actually pretty important in terms of how coordination is going. So I've sort of just given you the high-level view. There's a lot of detail, and if there's more questions to me or Julie tomorrow, we'd be glad to talk about it.